so very grateful that the Reverend Dr. Daisy Machado is a part of our community and a partner with us in ministry. The sermon she preached this past Sunday spoke to me in a profoundly personal and powerful way. It was a word I needed to hear, and I've been holding on to it all week long. Persisting beyond failure. Failure need not be fatal or final. Can even be fruitful if we persist. And so this morning, the Spirit has given me a kind of part two. I can't quite let go of this idea of persistence. So I want to talk for just a moment this morning about a persistent pest. A persistent pest. You know, I've had the good fortune all of my life to be surrounded by strong, powerful women. Starting with my mother, who celebrates in just a few days her 92nd birthday. I was the only boy in the household with 3 sisters, who I also count among strong, powerful women. And we like to say of our mother that going up against her was like leaning up against a big elephant. You can push back all you want, but after a while you find yourself moving in her direction. And I can really say that of my dear, sweet wife, Tina, who is one of the most beautiful, gentle, kind, loving, compassionate people you will ever meet, but her strength is never to be underestimated. You underestimate it at your own peril. You know I know of what I speak. These strong, powerful women in my life know me quite well, frighteningly so. Even I think sometimes better than I know myself. And though they are beautiful and kind and gentle and loving people, the kind of understated, unassuming veneer underneath, they can be so pushy and persistent that it is downright painful. By the way, Tina's out of town today, and I got permission to share this. These strong, powerful women in my life are brutally honest to a fault with me. I've said to them on occasion, you know, you are persistent to the point of being a pest. A persistent pest. Oftentimes, it is about some personal change they think I should make. Maybe exercise more, eat better, or spend more time with the family, or some project I should undertake, or some change they think I should lead in the life and work of the church. And sometimes I go long periods resisting these entreaties from these strong, powerful women, but in the end, I usually give in at least an attempt, or at least attempt to do whatever is being asked of me, simply because I can't handle the persistence and pestering. I don't want to give anybody any ideas here this morning, but without a doubt, persistence pays off. There is power in just persisting, in holding on and not giving up. That seems to be the lesson and message of the gospel reading. Jesus seems to suggest in this gospel reading from Luke that this should be our approach to God in prayer, persisting, pushing, bothering, even that there's a suggestion that even nagging God to the point of being a pest. You get results when you do that. Things happen when you persist. The Gospel of Luke was written some years after the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and people were starting to feel discouraged and dispirited, and they thought Jesus' return was imminent, any moment now. But they were still waiting and still being oppressed and still being persecuted as a tiny minority in the Roman Empire. They were anxious and they were suffering. And so the writer, trying to offer a word of encouragement and hope, picks up this parable that Jesus shared one day on prayer And the message seems to be that we ought to persist in prayer. Jesus had said years earlier to his disciples, that you ought to always pray and not give up, not lose heart. And he tells a story about a persistent widow and a heartless judge. He said in a certain town there was a judge, an unjust judge, an uncaring judge, cold and callous and non-compassionate judge. He didn't fear God. He didn't fear people. He didn't fear anybody or anything. He was all-powerful. He made life and death decisions every day and didn't fear anything or anybody. But there was a poor widow woman in this town, maybe with a kind of understated, unassuming veneer, on the very edge of society. She had absolutely no power to say anything, but she was determined to get a hearing. She refused to give up. And in this ancient, patriarchal, Mediterranean world where males alone play a public role, women dare not speak on their own behalf. But this poor widow woman, with no standing, no man, no protector to speak for her, always thought to be inferior and less than, decides to speak for herself, to be an advocate for herself and for her cause. Acting outside of the normal social mores and cultural bounds and expectations, she finds her voice and dares to speak up for herself. Barbara Brown Taylor says of her, society may have told her she was a nobody without a voice, but she knew in her heart otherwise, and her persistence helped her hold on to that knowledge. She's willing to say what she wanted out loud day and night, over and over, whether she got it or not, because saying it was how she remembered who she was. It's how she remembered the shape of her heart. I like that. It was how she remembered the shape of her heart. And so every time she sees this all-powerful judge, she cries out, "Give me justice." In the morning when he's headed to court, "Give me justice." In the afternoon when he's going to lunch, sitting at a table with his colleagues, there's this poor widow woman close by crying, "Give me justice." In the evening when he's headed home outside his chambers, she's crying, "Give me justice." When he's out with family and friends, there's this widow woman somewhere close by crying, "Give me justice." I mean, it got so bad people started whispering. It became embarrassing. She pushed and nagged, she persisted to the point of being a pest. Her in-your-face, audacious, annoying presence was so great that finally this cold, callous, uncaring judge, this man who didn't fear God nor had respect for people, felt completely beaten up by her persistence. The judge's eyes were not open to justice. His heart was not strangely warmed with compassion. His spirit wasn't suddenly compelled to righteousness. This judge simply went out and wore out. Woody Allen is famously quoted as insisting that 90% of life is just showing up. That's 90% of it, just showing up. This parable of the annoyingly persistent widow woman teaches us we must show up again and again and again. And only the most persistent, the most hard-hearted, the most knowing will make a difference. If you are seeking deliverance from the damnable, decadent, deplorable, detestable, death-like dilemmas in life, nothing works like definite, dogged, violent desire and determination. It is a demand that not even the deity can disregard or deny. Jesus seems to be saying that this is the way we should pray. We don't give up. We keep on crying for justice and righteousness and peace and goodness. We persist even to the point of being a pest. You get results that way. The folks who led this recent shameful government shutdown of the country and led the world almost to the brink of financial disaster seems to learn this lesson quite well about persistence. I mean, they won't give up even after Affordable Care Act passed both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President, affirmed by the Supreme Court, folks are still persistent. They're not giving up and changing. But you know, I worry not so much about them, but about the rest of us. Those of us in the communities of faith, where are our voices? Where is our witness? Even the word Christian, the definition of what it means to be Christian, what it means to be a person of faith, has been co-opted and hijacked by religious right and by extremism, almost been turned into a bad word. We've not done enough to let our culture and the world know that we serve a big God, a great big God, and that God calls us to be about a big, bold, beautiful, bodacious witness. There's enough for everybody. And we can provide for the least, the last, the lockdown, the poor, the homeless, the immigrant. There's enough for everybody, enough for everyone on this planet. And we ought not rest until it happens. Persistence pays off. Jesus seems to be saying that this is the way we come to God in prayer. Just persist to the point of getting a hearing and being a pest, and you will get a hearing. At least that's the way this lesson from the Gospel of Luke has been taught. But I think more than teaching us about persistence, Jesus is pointing us to God. Jesus is pointing us to the nature and heart of God. There's more here than a nice little lesson about persistence in prayer. Jesus is saying this is who God is. Look at this. He says, if a cold, callous, uncompassionate judge who's afraid of nobody and nothing hears the case of a poor widow woman just to avoid being embarrassed by her, well then how much more will God, the God of justice and love and compassion, the God of the prophets, the God of creation, who created you in God's image and after God's likeness, how much more will God hear the prayers of God's own children who cry out night and day from the suffering and their need? This is a story, my friends, finally not about a bad judge, finally not about an insistent widow woman. It's finally a story about God and about you and about me. This story says to us of a poor widow woman with no standing and finally wrangle justice out of a judge without honor. How much more will God, God's own child, the one God formed in the womb, the one God has loved from the very beginning, knowing the number of hairs even on your head, how much more will God hear and answer prayer? Society may have told this woman she was a nobody without a voice. You have no standing. You have no standing. You have no stature. You're queer. You even dare to say you are an illegal alien. You're a deviant. You're a nerd. You're an oddball. You're strange. You're different. But she knew otherwise. Her persistence helped her to hold on to that knowledge. And so persistence was not though for God, it was for her. Not because God is hard of hearing or needs to be convinced and persuaded by a constant banging at heaven's door, but persistence helps us. Persistence is a spiritual discipline. It reminds us of who and whose we are. It shapes our heart. It aligns us with the intentions of God. So in perfect God, the Danish 19th century theologians said prayer does not change God. Prayer changes the one who prays. Frederick Buechner said years ago, persistence is the key. Not because you got to beat a path to God's door, God will open it, but because until you beat the path, maybe there's no way of getting to your door. Amen. This, my friends, is the way of prayer and to faith and to God. Marcus Borg, in his book, The Heart of Christianity, says that faith is much more than just believing the correct things in our head. As he says, you can believe all of the right things and still be in bondage. You can believe all of the right things and still be miserable. You can believe all of the right things and still be unchanged. Believing a set of claims to be true has little transforming power. But it's when you move from believing to trusting, to resting, to relying on the promise. That's what makes the difference. Prayer and faith, says Borg, has to do with relationship. It's not mere words and rites and rituals. It's a relationship with giving your heart, your trust, your radical trust to God. Faith is like floating on a big, deep, wide ocean. If you struggle, if you tense up and thrash about, you'll eventually sink. But if you can just relax and trust, you'll float. Faith is trust. Faith is floating. Trusting in the buoyancy of God. Prayer and faith is trusting in the sea of being in which we live and move and have our being. A clergy friend from Chicago tells the story of a little girl and her father enjoying a quiet, beautiful, peaceful Sunday afternoon out on Lake Michigan. They were out on one of those catamarans in the middle of Lake Michigan. She was his only daughter. Somehow something hit the bottom of the catamaran. There was a hole in the bottom, and water immediately came pouring in from the hole. And the catamaran ended up at the bottom of Lake Michigan within 2 minutes' time. Now he could swim, but she couldn't. The problem was that he had a bad heart and had heart surgery. And with his weak heart, he couldn't swim the quarter of a mile back to the beach and pull her at the same time. So he said to her, "Baby, you remember how Daddy taught you how to float?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I want you to turn over on your back and float like Daddy taught you." And she turned over and started floating. He said, "Daddy's going to go and get help, and I'm coming back for you." He swam the quarter mile to the beach in 55th Street. Only when he got there were no boats there, so he found a ride down to Navy Pier, down around 12th Street. By the time he got back 55th Street, over an hour and a half had passed. There was no sign of his daughter. The boat started making wider and wider circles, and the day started coming to an end. The Coast Guard wanted to stop, but the man kept making them go wider and wider, further and further out into Lake Michigan until they'd gone about 4 miles out into the lake. He said as the sun was setting, "Can't we take one more sweep?" They said yes, but they knew it was all in vain, or so they thought. When they took the last sweep, they saw a little red bobbling dress about 400 yards out in the water. Knowing that she was dead, they determined to hold him in the boat because he wanted to jump back in the water and swim to his daughter. They restrained him. They said, "We'll go out and get her, sir. We'll get her." And as they went toward his daughter, instead of finding her dead, as they assumed, when they got 20 yards from her, there she was floating on the water, singing. They asked her, "Baby, how could you last this long?" She said, "It was easy. My daddy said he was coming back for me, and Daddy never breaks his promise. I just came to remind somebody here this morning that this is not